sometimes it's handy to be able to show or hide slices just to free up space for visuals on your report. And so what we can do is create what they call slicer panels. Now, first of all, I've gone to the support summary page where I've got a slicer by quarter and financial year. And really what I want to do is I want to add another slicer. So I've got a page with two slicers. So I'm going to click on this blank part of the report canvas here that I've created. And if I go to my fields pane, and particularly my geography query, I'm then going to grab the country region field. Oops, sorry. I'll put a slicer there and then I'll click country region. So basically, and drag that into the slicer. So basically I've created a second slicer in the spare area here that allows me to choose a particular country from this particular query here. Okay. So now we've got two slices on this one page. Now I want to bring up the selection page panel, and I'm fighting for space. I'm just going to collapse the fields, collapse the visualizations, go to view and bring up the selection panel or pane on the right hand side. So these are the 4 objects that I currently have sitting on this page called support summary. Now what I want to do is rename some of these. So this slicer here, when I click on it, is just called slicer. So I'm going to rename it by hitting the dots or double clicking and just call it date slicer. That's the name of that slicer, just so I can differentiate who's who. And if I click on this slicer, well, that's simply called slicer also. So if I double click there, I can actually call that country slicer and be able to easily identify those two objects on my page. Now what I want to do is I want to insert a rectangle. Should I name some of these other things? I'm thinking I might call this one here, that's okay, matrix. I might call this, I might just leave that as matrix, leave that as my KPI. Maybe I should call that KPI. I'm going to double click it and just call it KPI. So that's my KPI, that's my matrix, that's my date slicer, and that's my country slicer. Really handy to be able to name things using your selection panel. And I'm just now going to collapse that so it doesn't take up so much space. So as I was saying, I wanted to insert a rectangle, and I just want to put it on the top of the two slicers, well actually on the top of this slicer here. So I'm going to go insert, I'm going to go to shapes, and I'm going to choose rectangle, and there it is there. And I'm actually just going to format it, so I'm going to go format. And I need to change its style, and particularly its fill color, which is here, from this blue to just a light grey. And I want to drag the object until, in the selection pane, until that shape is at the top of the list, which it is, but if it wasn't, you can just drag it up and drag it down. So I want it to be at the top of the list. And I actually want the date slicer to be second, so I'll drag that up there, and the country slicer to be third. Now on the ribbon, I'm going to insert a button, and it's actually a left arrow. And I'm going to reduce the size of it, and I'm going to put it just sitting on top. Hold on a moment. I'm going to put it just down a bit, like over here, and just to the right, and I'll just reduce the size of it a little bit. So it's sort of like a little arrow like this, just to the top right of that slicer. I could even drag that. Actually, I might pull it that way, then pull it that way, and then lift it up like that. Alright, so that's my little... Now this rectangle, I actually want to move this and put it behind, so I'm just going to resize it, put it behind these two slices, so it actually looks like a panel. So I need to make sure that this shape, I'm just going to move that down, so that puts it behind the two slicers. Now let me just click on the date slicer. I'm just going to bring that in a little bit so I can actually see the grey behind it. So I'll bring that in a fraction and over a fraction and up. So this panel has got one slicer, and then the country slicer, I'm just going to reduce the width of that a little bit, move it up a little bit as well. So the purpose of making the rectangle, this shape here, is so it sits behind those two slices and gives it a grey panel effect, and we make it last. The button is sitting at the top here. Let me click button, and that really, do I want that sitting? I want that a little bit lower, like there. So that's sitting there. This is called date slicer. This is called country slicer. Okay, so the selection panel is really great for sort of like layering things and also good for identifying things. I think we can clearly say that now. Now the next thing I want to do is I actually want to group the two slices together. So I'm going to click on date slicer, hold the control key and click on country slicer. And I've chosen both of them. And then if I right click, I have the option to group and to group again. And so what it creates is one group called group 1. And what I do is I click on it and then double click it because I want to call it, this is my slicer panel. So I really am making a slicer panel. Now if I expand that, I can see the country and the date slicer are part of that panel. Now I also want to add the button as part of that. So I can literally click on button and drag it and drop it inside the panel as well. So I have button as part of that panel, maybe there. I'll also have the shape. So drag that in there as well. So I've got 4 things as part of my slicer panel, but I might move date up and I might move country up, and then button is 3rd, and then the shape is 4th. And I can collapse that panel and expand that panel and click away from that panel. Okay. Now I do need to manipulate it still so that I can actually see the button. Let me just hold for 5 for a second. In order for me to see that button, I'm going to have to move it up the layer. So click on button, and that's what these two are for. If I move it up, oops, click on button, move that up, move that up. If I make button first, I can see that back button there because it's sitting on top of the date slicer, which is 2nd. The country slicer is on the after the date slicer, that's fine, and then the shape is behind everything. And all 4 of those items are part of the slicer panel. So you've effectively created a slicer panel. Okay, so now we need to bring bookmarks into the mix. So I'm just going to hide the format pane, hide the selection pane, go to view and bring up my bookmarks. Now on the bookmark pane, I want to click the add button and I want to add a bookmark called show slicer panel because it's showing at the moment. So add, double click and say show slicer panel. And what I want to do also is untick data. By turning off data so that there's no other filter options in play. So that's that. So we've unticked the data option, and now what I want to do on the selection pane is I actually want to hide, just with this little eye, hide the slicer panel. And so that is another view now. So we add the view and we call it, double click, we call it hide slicer panel. So we made one view or bookmark that says show slicer panel, and now we're making another one that says hide slicer panel, and in both cases we turn data off. Okay, so now if I click on show slicer panel, it should actually show me. And it does. So hide slicer panel, show slicer panel, hide slicer panel, show slicer panel. That's how those 2 bookmarks or views should work. If you feel like it's not, you can go to show slicer panel, make sure that that's eye is turned on, and then just tell it to update the view or the bookmark. And then you can turn around and go to hide slicer panel and hide it, and then update it to make sure it actually works. And so then as you switch, that's the effect you should be getting, that it either hides or shows the slicer panel. Now the other thing we want to do is add a tooltip. So for this, I'm going to start by choosing hide slicer panel, and I'm going to insert a picture. So I'm going to go and click on a blank part of my report canvas. I'll go to insert in the ribbon, choose image, and the image I'm after is this hamburger button. So I'll open that. I'm going to move it into the top corner here, and I'm just going to resize it. Not too small, but small enough. Now I also want to add a tooltip to this particular button. So I'm going to go to my format pane, and I'm going to go to action and turn that on, and I'm going to expand action, and the action is going to be to show a bookmark, and the bookmark it's going to show is called show slicer panel. And then the tooltip, as I was saying, that I wanted to add is click to show filter panel. I may then want to, let's have a look. So I can see when I rest on this button, my tooltip, click to show the filter panel, and my filter panel is showing. But I need to make this back button that you see here, which I can just choose in my slicer panel, choose button. I need that to actually go back. And so I'm going to go to my, I've chosen it, I'm going to my format pane, I'm turning the action on, and I'm just choosing the action back. I can add a tooltip which basically says hide slicer panel. And so that's what that button would do. And even though if I rest on it, click away and rest on it, hide slicer panel. So if I hold the control key and click that, it hides the slicer panel. Let me just go back. It may be that they're too close to each other. So let me just move things around a little bit. So if I choose to move the date slicer down a bit, just for the moment. So that means that if I click that, it hides the slicer panel. Nope. Support. No, that will not do that. What am I doing? I'm clicking on that button. I'm going to action. I don't want to go back. I want to go to a bookmark, and the bookmark I want to go to is hide slicer panel. So that's when I control click it, and it hides the slicer panel, and I click this and it shows the slicer panel. That could be resized and made a little bit smaller. So I'll make that smaller. So that will actually show, and that will actually hide. It's a bit of fiddling, but it's actually quite good once it's all in place. So control click, hide the slicer panel, click, show the slicer panel. And of course when you hide it, notice that the arrow doesn't show because the arrow is part of that slicer panel group. So when you're hiding that group, that arrow is part, or that button is part of that slicer group. So that shows up and that hides it. And the tooltips are quite good in that they tell you what each button does. So that is creating a slicer panel, which includes one or more slices, using the selection bar to group them and call them slicer panel, and the importance of what the layering, what comes first. Being able to create bookmarks that show one view of the page without the slicer and one view with the slicer, and then be able to create buttons, custom or otherwise, that then show you the bookmark you want to see, whether it's hide slicer or show slicer.